Hello, everybody. This is Fernando for the latest mysteries and disappearances video. Every now and then, I do these videos when I come across something that I read online, either through the Google News app or through other various news websites out there, such as the case with this murder mystery that was finally solved almost 50 years after it occurred. So, can you believe that? 47 years it took for this murder mystery to be solved. It just goes to show the dedication associated with various law enforcements and then, of course, the family members as well to make sure that the answer is given and that justice is served. But yes, I just came across this the other day. It was actually something that finalized a couple of years ago. So there's some updates associated with that too, along with the man who had committed the murder in of itself. But you're looking at a picture of the young woman here. Her name was Christy Ellen Bryant, and this video again has to do with the solved mystery associated with the murder of Christy Ellen Bryant. So let's go ahead and let's talk about this information here. I'll give my own thoughts and opinions on there as well. Anybody from the areas that I'm about to talk about too, if you have some more experience on a local level, please feel free to post any comments on there too. So here's what had occurred with this very unfortunate, very tragic circumstance. So you have to go back to July 31st, 1974. It was on a Wednesday. It was on the overnight hours, in fact. That was when a young woman named Christy Ellen Bryant, who was all but 22 years old at the time, was working at a location that used to be a 7-Eleven store. In fact, the exact address is 702 Highland Avenue in National City. So she was there working the overnight hours. She was there actually by herself, if you could believe that. It's always dangerous to work like in a situation like that, but imagine just being so young and then also being by yourself. And it just shows to show just how extreme circumstances can be, and that's what unfortunately happened here. But as it occurred that night, a mysterious man apparently entered that location. I don't know what happened. The details are still pretty scarce, even to this day. Not much is known about what occurred on the inside that led to the murder, but what had happened was eventually this man at that time, who was unknown, ended up taking poor Christy into the back of that 7-Eleven store and ended up stabbing her no less than 30 different times. 30 different times. Can you believe that? So when that occurred, he basically left her there and there was no motive, nothing given. The information that I was reading stated that nothing else was given in terms of clues as to why this occurred. Apparently, this person did not know her. Apparently, nothing was robbed as well. Everything was just there. Like, in other words, in terms of this horrific murder that occurred, she ended up actually dying there within that restaurant, within that 7-Eleven, which is now actually a Domino's pizza fast food restaurant. You're looking at a picture of it as it stands today, and she was left there, and then police were eventually able to find what occurred, and then they created that as they basically took it over as a crime scene. But yeah, again, no motive was given at all, at least during that time period. And who knows, maybe even if he states later on what occurred, maybe that might help provide some information afterwards. But still, no leads were given, no indications as to who he was. The only thing that was left was this. Apparently, during that cold stabbing that he was doing, something had occurred where he ended up getting a cut. So this person got the cut there, this murderer, and then he left, but not without leaving blood samples. And in fact, these were blood samples that eventually were collected right there at the scene of the crime and then stored afterward to see what could be used afterwards. Yeah, it says that there must have been some struggle, according to the police, what they were stating, and the defendant ended up cutting himself with the knife, leaving a bloody trail, and then that was what was stored, again, to be used to see what could occur. Even though DNA sampling was not necessarily used at that time, the wherewithal to have it stored at least was kept to ensure that maybe something could be done with it afterwards. And then even though there were some leads, investigative leads that were done, and then there were some investigations done throughout that location as well. For all intents and purposes, this mysterious man, whoever he was at that time, just basically fled and then left and was able to disappear. In fact, it says here that the National City Police were unable to identify the killer during the initial investigation, and the case ended up going cold. But again, I mentioned earlier with regards to the dedication associated with law enforcement, with law personnel. So over the years, the family and then others kept at it. Like they wanted to make sure that this case didn't go into any kind of back burner. And with regards to this very tragic circumstance with this young girl, that nothing happened where it just disappeared, like where no justice would be done, nothing would be done towards finding who the killer was. By all intents and purposes, even though it had gone cold, in at least on the front it was, but on the back end, behind the scenes, there were still actions that were taking place. In fact, in 2008, investigators ended up submitting that blood over to the San Diego Sheriff's Crime Laboratory to see if they could do something with it. In fact, there was a system there at the time that was called CODIS, which is Combined DNA Index System, but unfortunately, this ended up not producing any leads. It was checked and then rechecked several times over the years, but still, nothing was conclusive. Then in 2012, the same detectives decided that they wanted to run it through another office, this one through the San Diego Sheriff's Office that dealt with something called the YSTR analysis. That way they could try to see if they could do some DNA testing, but on the genealogical level. I got the sense that this is where they're trying to pierce together family members associated with that DNA, so that way they could in turn lead to whoever the real suspect was. Nothing really came about from there either. And so in 2013, that same department, the NCPD, they joined forces with the San Diego County District, and then they joined forces with the Cold Case Homicide Unit to try to see if something could be done. According to various articles I was reading, this was done because each time there was a new advancement in forensic technologies, this was one of the first cases that was placed within it. In fact, it was the idea that there was a grant that I was reading that is in place. I've heard of this grant before, actually, in other articles having to do with other cases, but it's a grant that's called the Cold Homicide and Research Genealogy Effort, otherwise known as CHARGE. And this is money that is given as grants, I believe, by both individuals and also governmental departments to ensure that such efforts are in place to make these cases continue to process in the background. Well, that's what was used for this case as well. And as it turns out, there was suddenly a lead. Something occurred. There was a hit. A suspect was identified. And then you're looking at him right now. That's him right there. His name is Carl Edward Cornett. He ended up actually being 68 at the time of his arrest, and he was arrested there in Las Vegas. So he had fled California at the time whenever this murder had occurred, and then he had left there to go to Nevada, to Las Vegas, Nevada, sometime afterward, just basically living his life as is. But of course, finally, justice was able to come. 47 years later, he was arrested there in his home, and then he was charged afterward with the second-degree murder. In fact, he ended up pleading guilty to it as well. And because of the weird laws, apparently his sentence was such so that he didn't get what would be today's type of punishment, but instead the punishment of when the murder occurred back in 1974. Back then, if you were convicted of second-degree murder, you would get 5 years to life in prison. Today, it would be 15 years to life in prison. But again, because this murder occurred in 1974, the way those weird laws work, he was sentenced to that term. So that's where it stands right now. So this guy, this murderer, ended up actually being convicted, and now he's in jail, presumably for at least 5 years, but I imagine for a little bit longer period than that, whenever it comes to this type of brutal, heinous murder that he did. But he's there now, again, thanks to the dedication of various law enforcement, police departments, technological departments, and of course the family associated with this murdered girl. In fact, the family ended up giving more information associated with her as well, for Christy Bryant. It turns out she was actually someone who was previously military. She was originally in the United States Marine Corps, and she ended up moving to San Diego in 1971, but she was involved in some kind of serious car accident shortly afterwards, so she ended up retiring from the armed services, and then she was basically there in that national city, and then shortly after that time period, she ended up working there in that 7-Eleven, of course, oblivious as to what would happen to her afterwards, but that's essentially what was her life beforehand. Her family, in fact, described her as very friendly, always very helpful. She was known as the type of person who would go out of her way to help others. And up until the time of her murder, herself and her sister would call each other constantly, always wishing each other's birthday as well. And so part of the articles that I was reading were stating that they were, of course, finally, in the lucid sense, happy that there was this justice done. And at the same time, they're hoping that whatever that happened with this murder, that he'll stay there in prison and that his family as well, even though obviously that what occurred to them was what happened with the relative that they have. She was the one that ended up being murdered, but the murderer's family, they also wished them essentially well, as to make sure that there was some finality associated on their end too. But otherwise, that's it. Like, that's all the information associated with this very unique case. 50 years, took almost 50 years for it to be solved, but finally, after all these leads, exhaustible leads, one after the other, different tries, different attempts here and there, different departments taking over. Finally, there was a suspect given, and then he was sentenced. So it goes to show again, a lot of these videos that I do on mysteries and disappearances, you'll find a theme associated with them too, where I'm talking about maybe one day there'll be an answer. Maybe there'll finally be a solution given to the mysteriousness of whatever I'm talking about in that subject, no matter how long it takes. So maybe it's something like this. This is what occurs whenever there's that kind of dedication, and then there's also finally a resolution given. Even if it takes 50 years, there's always an answer afterwards. But in any case, just wanted to share this video here so that way it shows that justice is given to this poor young girl, and of course what happened to her. If anybody else has any more info, anything else I might have missed, anybody there from that area too, both in Las Vegas, where he ended up moving, and then also, of course, where this occurred in National City, where this occurred for poor Christy Bryant, then please let me know. Post it in the comments. All right, everyone. Thanks again as always. Take care.